What's up, guys? Welcome back to the Combat Athlete Physio YouTube channel, where we take human movement science and we bring it to the combat sports. In today's module 109 of our Intro to Combat Sport Biomechanics course. In module 109 is all about breaking down the movement of the thoracic and the lumbar spine. But as the video progresses, I may refer to those two things as the trunk, so just be prepared for that. And as always, we're going to do three things for each movement. We're going to identify the movement relative to anatomical neutral position, we're going to identify the plane of movement, and the axis of rotation. The movements that we're going to cover are trunk flexion, trunk extension, trunk lateral flexion or side bending, and then trunk rotation. And now to the Human Anatomy Atlas app to help with visualization. Okay, so first we have spinal flexion or trunk flexion. So we see that relative to the anatomical neutral position, body facing forward, you don't have the arms in this one, but you can see that it's just the act of bending forward. So you're bringing your trunk forward while your pelvis is staying neutral. So you're not bending at the pelvis, you're bending at the spine. And so what we see is the plane of movement through which that is moving is the sagittal plane, since the sagittal plane cuts the body into right and left halves. So since it's moving through that plane, we know that the sagittal plane requires a medial to lateral axis. So spinal flexion relative to the anatomical neutral position is just the act of bending the trunk forward. And it moves through the sagittal plane and about a medial lateral axis of rotation. Next is spinal extension. So as I press play, we'll look and see what's happening from anatomical neutral, and as you may have guessed, this is just the opposite movement of spinal flexion. This is become a recurring theme in some of the joints. So we have a lot of joints have flexion and extension. So the extension portion is just moving in the opposite direction. So you could tell, again, relative from anatomical neutral in the front, this is just the act of looking up. Okay, so not only in the cervical spine we saw the act of looking up was with the shoulders stationary. And so this is important. We have to know that the hips are stationary, or the pelvis is stationary, and the shoulders are actually moving with us here. So the axis of rotation, as we'll talk about here in a second, is actually around that lumbothoracic spine. So the act of looking up is spinal extension with the hips stationary. And so we can tell that very much like spinal flexion, spinal extension or trunk extension is moving through that sagittal plane. And we know that since the sagittal plane is the plane that cuts the body into right and left halves, particularly in this movement, that the sagittal plane requires a medial to lateral axis of rotation. So spinal extension relative to anatomical neutral is just the act of looking up with the hips stationary. It's moving through the sagittal plane and about a medial to lateral axis of rotation. And next we have lateral flexion or side bending. So let's look at the movement relative to anatomical neutral. So we'll pause here. We can see that the body is facing us with the palms facing forward. I'm glad they added the arm here because that helps us kind of orient ourselves with the body. So as we press play, we see that as the hips stay stationary, the spine is just bending to the side. So this is very similar to what we saw in the cervical spine. And this is important. I'm glad that it included the shoulders because the hips are stationary and the shoulders are actually moving relative to the hips, even though the movement and the axis of rotation is going through the spine. This is why it's a trunk movement. So we can tell that since the plane of movement that I've drawn here cuts the body into front and back halves, we know that that is the frontal or the coronal plane. And now that we know that it's the coronal plane or the frontal plane, the coronal plane requires an anterior to posterior oriented axis of rotation. So trunk side bending relative to anatomical neutral position is moving through the frontal plane and moving about an anterior to posterior axis of rotation. And finally, we have trunk rotation. So let's look at it from anatomical neutral position as if they're looking straight at us, as the skeletal man is looking directly at us. We could tell that if he were to have shoulders, that the shoulder plane is moving separate from the hip plane. So this is just the act of rotating the spine from one side to the other. It's a lot easier to tell from this view. So we could tell that if the shoulders and the head are to move together, and the shoulders would move independently from the hips. So this is how you know that you're rotating about the trunk. And so if we look at the plane of movement through which it's occurring, we could tell that this plane, the transverse plane, cuts the body into top and bottom halves. And then we know that since that's the case, we need a vertical axis of rotation. because that's what's coupled with transverse plane movements. So spinal rotation or trunk rotation is happening through the transverse plane and about a vertical axis of rotation. I talk a lot about the trunk in all of my breakdowns, and this is because a strong trunk builds a really good foundation for any type of striking or grappling movements. And as always, time for a quiz. When you're performing a side kick, through which plane and about which axis is the trunk moving? During a side kick and relative to the trunk or the spine, through what plane of movement and about what axis of rotation is it moving? True or false? Spinal or trunk rotation occurs about a vertical axis. Number 3, what spinal movement is Haggerty performing here when he does a front kick? What spinal movement is Haggerty performing when he does this front kick? All right, so you guys know the deal by now. The pinned comment of the next video is going to have all the answers from this quiz. And I'll see you in the next module when we look at the hip joint. Thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you next time.